In the year 301, a Roman emperor tried to freeze the price of everything. Diocletian's edict listed more than 1,000 goods and wages, carved into stone from Aphrodisias to the edge of the empire, enforceable by death. And buried in that list is a number that should stop you cold. 1 Roman pound of plain white silk, 12,000 denarii. On the same stone, the emperor capped what a farm laborer could earn, 25 denarii a day, plus food. Do the division. 480 days of human labor for a single pound of thread. That is the number that built a trade route across 5,000 miles of desert, mountain, and steppe. Not romance, not adventure, a spread. So here's the question nobody asks about the Silk Road. Forget the poetry. If you had walked into a courtyard in Samarkand with your family's savings in a leather bag, and you wanted to put that money into a caravan, what were you actually buying? What did it cost to start? Who lent you the money, and at what rate? Who taxed you, and how many times? What was your margin, and what was the real chance you'd never come home? We're going to build the balance sheet, and the answer is going to be nothing like the story you were told. Start with the entry price, because there were 2 completely different businesses hiding under the same name. At the top end, we have an actual figure from a Florentine banker named Francesco Balducci Pegolotti, who worked for the Bardi Company and compiled a merchant's handbook sometime around 1340. His benchmark for a merchant heading from the Black Sea to China, goods worth 25,000 gold florins. That's roughly 88 kilograms of pure gold, moving on the backs of animals through territory ruled by 4 different Mongol Khanates. But most people in this trade were not that man. Down in the oasis of Turfan, on the northern rim of the Taklamakan, thousands of documents survived because the locals made paper hats and shoes for their dead out of recycled contracts, and archaeologists later took the shoes apart. In those documents we can read the real price list. In 673, a camel changed hands for 14 bolts of silk. In 733, a horse for 18. In 731, an 11-year-old girl was sold for 40. Yes, girls and boys. The slave trade was not a footnote to this business, it was inventory. So the small operator's startup cost was maybe a dozen animals and a dozen people. And here's the first surprise. That dozen was typical. Buddhist stories love to describe caravans of 500 merchants, and that may be a literary convention. But the surviving Tang travel permits, documents that listed every human and every animal by name, and in one case by the age and color of 8 different horses, show parties of about a dozen, sometimes clustering into groups of 50 for a dangerous stretch. Which brings us to the business model. And this is where the myth cracks. Almost nobody went end to end. The trade was a relay. You bought in one oasis, you sold in the next, and the goods passed hand to hand with a margin taken at every transfer. Around the year 600, officials at a tax station outside Turfan kept receipts on every weighed transaction. Historians have those receipts, 37 of them, covering a year. 41 of the 49 merchants named have Sogdian surnames, which tells you who dominated this trade. Not the Chinese, not the Romans, but Iranian-speaking merchants from the region around Samarkand. And look at what they were actually buying. Spices, gold, silver, silk thread, ammonium chloride, a flux for melting metal and fixing dyes. Not one of them bought silk cloth. Why? Because that station taxed by weight, and cloth was sold by length. The most famous commodity on the Silk Road slipped through the most detailed record we have of Silk Road commerce, for an accounting reason. Now the cost structure, which is where this stops being history and starts being finance. Pegolotti tells us what the journey cost, 60 to 80 ingots of silver for the outbound leg, if you managed well. He also tells us an ingot was worth 5 florins, so call it 300 to 400 florins of expenses, against 25,000 florins of cargo. That's an overhead ratio of roughly 1.5%. Sit with that. The single most dangerous commercial journey in the medieval world had a shipping cost that would look competitive today. Because the physics were extraordinary. A Bactrian camel carries something like 150 to 250 kilograms, eats scrub, drinks rarely, and survives temperature swings that would kill a horse. The historian Richard Bulliet made the argument decades ago. In this terrain, camels beat carts, because carts require roads, and roads require states willing to maintain them. So transport was cheap, which means the caravan business was never really about transport. It was about capital, and that is a very different problem, as the 4th century Mail tells us. In 1907, the archaeologist Aurel Stein found a bag of undelivered letters in the ruins of a watchtower west of Dunhuang. They were written in Sogdian, most likely in 313 or 314. The dating is still argued over. One of them, from a merchant named Nanai von Dak to his employer in Samarkand, is a masterpiece of business correspondence. It reports catastrophe. The Chinese capital burned. The emperor fled. Famine, and Sogdian and Indian residents dead of starvation. Then it turns to the money. He gives instructions about a deposit held by another man, which must be sealed and not transferred. He tells his partners to count it, to add the accrued interest to the principal, and to record it in a transfer document. And he explains why it matters. An orphan boy's survival depends on the income from that capital. Deposits, compound interest, written transfer instruments, trusts for minors. 1700 years ago, in a letter that never arrived. That's the financing side at the small scale. At the imperial scale, it got far more aggressive. Under the Mongols, the ruling family did something recognizably modern. They became venture investors. Princes, generals, and imperial women handed silver ingots to merchant partners, the Orta, who traded on their behalf. The structure looked remarkably like the Islamic Mudaraba or the Italian Commenda. The investor's downside was capped at what he put in, while the merchant risked his reputation and his labor. But over time, the money got smarter and meaner. As losses mounted, the princes shifted from equity to lending, and once it's a loan, the merchant is on the hook for all of it. Risk moved from the people with capital to the people doing the work. If that sounds familiar, it should. And the rates were savage. In 1237, a song envoy reported the terms. 1 ingot of principal, rolled over for 10 years, becomes 1,024. That's doubling every single year. Which raises the question you should be asking. What kind of margin clears 100% annual cost of capital? The Turfan documents give us the local benchmark. The going rate on a private loan in that oasis ran around 10% per month. The Tang legal code capped interest at 6% a month, and the code was simply ignored. Everybody paid it. Long-distance traders and the farmer down the road borrowing 20 silver coins in the spring because he was short before harvest. So the hurdle rate on this business wasn't 10% a year. It was 10% a month. Anything that didn't clear, that was a hobby. Now, the state. Because there was never just one tax. In the Islamic world, customs duties were commonly scaled by religion. Roughly 2.5% for Muslims, 5% for protected Christians and Jews, 10% for everyone else. Under the Mongols, that framework was replaced by the tamga, a commercial stamp tax collected at city gates on marked goods, which clergy denounced as unlawful and rulers kept anyway because it worked. At the far western end, Rome charged a 25% duty on Eastern imports. And then there was the levy that didn't look like a levy at all. Pegalotti warns his readers plainly, carry silver into China, and the ruler will take it and hand you paper money in exchange. 4 notes to the ingot. A forced currency conversion at the border, imposed by the largest economy on earth on merchants who had no alternative. Speaking of currency, the exchange desk was its own business. In Turfan, people paid in Sasani and Persian silver coins for generations. Then, right around the year 700, they abandoned them almost overnight and switched to Chinese bronze. Everyone, rich and poor, in the same handful of years. And underneath both was a third currency, cloth. A standard tang bolt of silk ran 40 Chinese feet. Not coincidentally, just enough to make a suit of clothes. In 692, one bolt bought 10 silver coins, or 320 bronze. In the Turfan market register of 743, officials listed high, medium, and low prices for over 350 goods, and a bolt of degummed silk sat around 450 to 470 coins. Why did an empire run on fabric? Because a string of bronze coins weighed more than 4 kilograms. Coins could be counterfeited and debased, grain rotted, and if things went truly wrong, you could cut up your money and wear it. So, cheap transport, brutal capital costs, layered taxes, 3 currencies. What actually killed you? Around the year 670, a Chinese merchant named Li Shaojin met a Sogdian trader, Cao Yanyan, at Gongyuacheng, near the modern Kazakh border, some 2,500 kilometers west of the Chinese capital. They formed a partnership. Li borrowed 275 bolts of silk. They agreed to meet again in Kucha. Cao Yanyan set out with 2 camels, 4 cattle, 1 donkey, and a load of silk, Bowls, saddles, bows and arrows. He never arrived. One witness guessed that Turkish bandits killed him for the weapons and the saddles. And so the debt vanished. Until the dead man's younger brother, Cao Lushan, walked into a Tang courtroom and sued. The contract copy was gone. Li denied everything. But two Sogdian merchants had witnessed the original loan, and under Tang law their testimony carried the same weight as the paper. The court ordered repayment with interest. Then the documents stopped. We have no idea whether he ever collected. That case tells you what risk management really looked like out there. Not insurance, enforcement. Networks of guarantors who vouched that your slave wasn't kidnapped and your horse wasn't stolen, and who were financially liable if they were wrong. Travel permits checked at every pass. Witnesses who could be produced in court 2,000 kilometers from where the deal was struck. Trust was the product. Everything else was freight. But no amount of paperwork protects you from politics. And politics is what actually ended this business twice. In 755, the An Lushan rebellion pulled the Tang armies home from Central Asia. And here's the part the romantic version leaves out. The money went with them. Look at what the Tang state was actually shipping west. One vice commander records a single payment of 200,000 bolts of silk. Garrisons at Dunhuang received 10,000 bolts at a time. The empire's own revenue accounts for the 740s and 750s list 25 million piculs of grain and 27 million pieces of textiles, against only 2 million strings of coin. The Chinese government was chronically short of cash, so it paid its frontier soldiers and officials in cloth. Those soldiers spent that cloth in oasis markets. That is why 33 different textiles were for sale in Turfan in 743. Which leads to the conclusion that some historians, Valerie Hansen and Eric Trombert prominently among them, have pressed hard, and which others still resist. The Great Age of Silk Road trade may have been, to a significant degree, a byproduct of military spending. When the subsidy stopped, the boom stopped. The second ending was slower and more familiar. Pegalotti wrote his handbook describing a road that was, by his account, safe. He never traveled it. And within a few years of his writing, the Ilkhanate fractured after 1338, a usurper seized Almalai in 1339, and the overland corridor became something no insurer would touch. Then the balance sheets caught fire at home. The Peruzzi Company collapsed in 1343, the Acciaiuoli in 1345, and in 1346, the Bardi, Pegolotti's own firm, went under, wrecked in large part by an English king who didn't repay his loans. The following year, Genoese galleys reached home from the Black Sea carrying the plague. So who actually got rich? Almost never the man leading the camels. The winners were the people who never crossed a desert. The moneylender in Turfan, a militia soldier named Zuo Chongshi, who died around 673 and was buried with 14 intact contracts, apparently hoping to collect his debts in the afterlife. The guarantors collecting fees, the innkeepers who doubled as warehousemen, the officials who stamped goods at the gate, the Mongol princes who supplied capital and stayed home, the Florentine banks that financed the cargo and never smelled the dust, and the modern lessons write themselves because none of them have changed. Value density beats volume. If your freight cost is 1% of cargo value, geography stops mattering. Your real cost is capital, not logistics. Political risk isn't a footnote in the model. It is the model. Whoever controls the choke points, the currency, and the courts captures the margin, not whoever does the traveling. And a business that depends on a government spending is only as durable as that government's budget. Which brings us to the biggest misconception of all. There was no Silk Road. There was no single highway. No single caravan crossing from China to Rome. No lone merchant returning with a fortune. The phrase itself was coined by a German geographer in the 19th century, and we have been arguing about the reality underneath it ever since. What actually existed was a chain of short local, heavily taxed, credit finance transactions between neighbors, most of them moving grain, cloth, animals, and people, not treasure, held together by contracts, guarantors, and government payrolls. The silk was real. The road was an accounting system. Everyone remembers the camels. Almost nobody remembers the ledgers. And the ledgers are where the money always was,